to this edition of the Human School's Mindshift Cards Conversation, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. Each week, we model some inquiry conversation around one of the Mindshift cards in our Mindshift Cards pack of cards. And there are sets available at thehuman.school. So in this episode, we are going to talk about a question that we often talk about here, which is about leadership. And today's question is around describing the behaviors of a leader that might frustrate you. What is it that a leader, those frustrating things that they do that really, let me reframe the question. What do they do or not do that is leading in a frustrating way? So really, this is about things that we see from a human-centered perspective that frustrate us with the leaders around us. So Randy, go ahead. I know you were chomping at the bit.
I'll throw one idea on the table, and that is I think that this idea comes from the fact that we live in a society that's very much based on hierarchy. So one of the behaviors of leaders that I find to be frustrating is when they act like parents. And and their followers are children. And I think a lot of it stems from ego. A lot of it stems from control, and probably the sort of like endorphin rush of just telling people what to do. So I've been in numerous situations throughout my career where the person with the title behaves like the parent. And, from the human-centered lens, what they fail to do, I'll say fail to do, is see that the other people on the other side of that relationship actually bring a set of experiences and a set of knowledge that could be useful in their work as a leader. And so they don't see that because they see themselves as the parent and the person who has all the knowledge, and therefore they're going to direct and counsel and cajole people into doing things. And so I would say that is a pretty annoying behavior, parenting.
I mean, I think about our compass points, and so much of the mind shifts that are there are really about leadership. So the ones for me that, if I could boil it down, it's when leaders are unwilling to explore what happened, or they're unwilling to interrogate situations in an organization or in the people that they serve, or they're not willing to explore how to improve conditions, and they're not curious. Like, to me, all that wrapped into one, where we're just okay with the status quo. We're okay with things being the way they are, and kind of just being totally unwilling to consider that something is not as good as it possibly can be. And that doesn't mean that you have to act on things or make massive changes. I think there's that statement that, if you ask people and then you don't deal with it or address it, like, why bother? And I just don't subscribe to that philosophy. I think that we can prioritize, we can make decisions about how we move forward, but that unwillingness to ask the question. So I think a frustration that I have a lot of times is when leaders aren't willing to consider how to keep growing or changing or evolving or moving forward.
I think similarly to that, I'm thinking about people or leaders who know that there's an issue, who are aware of it, but are afraid to address it. And I think it's a really human behavior, but that thinking about, feeling like as a leader, that your staff or your building is really struggling to connect, and getting so wrapped up in the anxiety around the steps to take and the potential reactions and the people who are going to say X, Y, Z, and therefore just avoiding the difficult conversations or the authentic conversations and not trying to problem solve around it. I think similarly to what you're saying, I don't think that they're okay with the status quo. I think that they're uncomfortable, but that the status quo is less scary than the sort of next step piece. I think is just unfortunate. And I mean, there's nowhere to go in that situation but get worse. But I think a lot of people can recognize that there's a problem in the system, in the building, in the school, for the students, but are afraid of the difficulty and the stress and the conflict around brainstorming and asking those questions and actually trying to make changes. So they just don't.
I think the compass is actually a good tool to to use to look at this question.
Yeah.
So another thing that I'll throw on the table is people with the power who feel they should be the only storyteller. Like they've got a market on that. And you see this a lot, I think, with particularly, I'm comfortable in the superintendent world, but it's like the superintendent's the chief storyteller. Instead of creating the conditions for other people, especially students, to tell their story, it becomes the superintendent who's sort of the mouthpiece of everything. And I'll tell you, it's usually the superintendent that's hardly ever involved in most of that stuff anyway. And so they tell the story and it appears like they've got all the credit, which goes back to the whole ego piece and got to be the parent and got to be the person in control and telling people what to do. And so, but going back to more of a human school connection, I think the compass is, we could probably go through each of those 4 points and 9 mind shifts and maybe a few other things and come up with a pretty interesting laundry list of things that irritate us.
I mean, I think when you think about like designing with others as a mind shift, right? And how, you know, some of the more annoying leadership styles are delegation or directive type things. I mean, when you're told this is something you must do, or this is now your responsibility, and the person who gave you that task isn't actively designing with you or supporting you or providing you support and feedback, those are other, what I would call like really frustrating leadership qualities. And through the mind shifts, Randy, you just said, like, that's another one. Like, you know, are they willing to be an objector? Are they engaged in design work? Like, I think there's a lot of leaders who, again, I'm speaking in general terms, don't design or engage in designing anything. They delegate down, you know, and then to your point, you know, are they willing to ask, well, when things don't go well or when things do go well, are we willing to ask and celebrate that? And then to your point, Randy, are they celebrate? So I agree with you. I think that the compass point and the mind shifts are a really fascinating lens, not just to talk about school design, but also internally who we are as leaders. And again, it's a continuum. Right. So like, I want to be very clear. This is not to say that any one person exemplifies all of these or, you know, or none of them. It's people exist on a continuum, but are we willing to question that? So
I'm wondering about the curator piece. How do you see that in that work? I mean, I have an idea, but.
Say more.
So I'm thinking about like leveraging the insider perspective, right? And so go ahead.
Well, I mean, immediately in my mind, I think we're seeing this play out in school boards across, you know, everywhere now, right now, which is that the insider perspective has been ignored, you know, literally in schools and then in classrooms and then down to the student level. And we've talked about it countless times. Like if you're the teacher and you see yourself as the leader of the classroom, how are you leveraging your kids' insider perspective? Like, I think for me, that particular mind shift is about going down to whoever that person is who authentically needs the agency to learn and grow. And so I think that we see countless situations where leaders choose to allow those who are external stakeholders dictate what's happening inside our schools and classrooms. I don't know. Again, Randy could probably speak to that better than I could. But
I was also thinking about the superintendent piece. And so like working at the district level, there's a lot of things that you understand as more complicated. Then I'm thinking about having been in the classroom versus having worked in district office, you start to see how much more complicated things are. And so I think often as a teacher, I would feel like I didn't understand why a decision was being made and unfortunately would assume therefore that there's poor intention, right? But that there is a benefit to that insider perspective that I feel like sometimes isn't shared. And I don't know why, if it's a lack of comfort or if it's because it's just really complicated. And so taking that time is hard. So
I know I didn't let you finish your thought, but one of the things I wanted to challenge there, though, is I think this is a problem with district office folks who then walk into classrooms and assume that it's not complex or complicated. Like, I think this is the lack of empathy and willingness to consider what we're seeing or being non-judgmental. So I would argue that a classroom is highly complicated and complex with 28 to 30 different people's unique needs. It's not, it's its own ecosystem. So I think that what happens is someone walks into a classroom and they see a lesson and they think whatever things they think they see through that process, and they form all kinds of opinions about it based on that one day. And I would argue that that same thing, while yes, seeing things at the district level, or in my case, the county or statewide level, unveils complexity, I think that classrooms are incredibly and inherently complex systems and organizations in and of themselves, and that those who serve positionally above mistake that complexity because it's not the same type of complexity. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I think that that same judgment that we might have up to people above us also gets pushed down because we're not seeing each other through a human lens.
Sure. But what I was trying to ask is, I think that teachers, like, I think both places are complicated and complex, no question, like none whatsoever. I think my wonder, though, is as a teacher, I didn't have a hard time explaining to a superintendent or a principal what they saw. So when I got observed and when it felt like maybe they were oversimplifying something that they saw, I felt comfortable saying, like, hey, here's the rest of the story to help you understand. Whereas I don't get the sense, and this is not a blame, this is a wonder why, I don't get the sense that the complexity is something that is often explained from the district level to the teacher level. And so working there and hearing about why some of the choices are made the way that they are was really interesting to me as a teacher, because it was stuff that I didn't know. And so I wonder if there's a reason why sometimes that thought process isn't shared in the other direction, that like most teachers, I think, don't struggle to explain the complexity and talk often about that misunderstanding. But I don't hear leaders at the district level explaining to teachers how maybe their thought process is oversimplified from the reality of what has occurred. Does that make sense? That's what I'm talking about.
The way that you're describing it sounds to me like the parent-child relationship again, because parents don't feel usually that they need to explain everything to their children and that sort of thing. So, and just to sort of wrap this up and bring this to the human school lens, we've talked about, I think we said the word judge. I think we said the word empathy. I think there's a couple other kind of judgy words that we threw out there too. And I think that while the question itself is kind of loaded in a negative sense, that we do have to sort of zoom back up to the 35,000 foot level and say, like, people that do behave in a way that we don't appreciate, while it's important for us to surface that feeling and to learn from that, that it's probably the way that they're operating is probably because that's all that is in their head. And one of the things that we're trying to do here is to help people see that there are other possibilities, and trying to be positive about that too, that people don't behave in ways that irritate us necessarily out of intention. They behave because that's what their experience is, and that's what their mental models, and that's what they act upon. And how do we change those? And that's really kind of what we're here trying to do, I guess.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you guys for a great conversation again, as always, and just remind our audience that you can learn more about the Human School at thehuman.school, and check out our conversations page for more conversations like this and others. And thanks again, guys. Appreciate it.